Delta Force Commander Silas Vance looked at the soft-spoken nurse and saw only a fragile grandmother standing in his way. He saw weakness. He didn't see the shadow operator who had once performed surgery in a collapsing cave under mortar fire. He shoved her aside, barking for a real medic who understood war. He had no idea that the woman standing before him didn't just serve in the shadows, she ruled them. And when she finally rolled up her sleeve, the black rose inked on her scarred skin would bring the legendary ghost to his knees. The rain in Seattle did not simply fall that night. It hammered against the earth with the malice of a living thing. A historic storm had stalled over the Pacific Northwest, turning the sky into a bruising shade of charcoal and violet. The wind howled through the steel canyons of the downtown grid, stripping leaves from the decorative maples and turning the gutters into rushing torrents of black water. It was the kind of weather that made the city feel small, fragile, and terrified. Through this deluge, a man walked alone. He moved with a gait that was terrifying to witness. It was not a walk, but a forced march against gravity and biology. Lieutenant Colonel Silas "Ghost" Vance looked less like a human being and more like a statue that had been animated by sheer, spiteful willpower. He was a massive man, standing well over 6 feet, with a face carved from granite and years of unmanaged regret. His jaw was covered in a rough, graying stubble, and his eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean, cold, flat, and devoid of fear. He wore a dark, heavy tactical jacket that was soaked through, the fabric clinging to his frame. To a casual observer, he might have looked like a homeless veteran seeking shelter. But Silas was not seeking shelter. He was seeking repairs. Every step sent a jolt of white-hot lightning up his spine. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, a dead weight that swung with a sickening lack of rhythm. The paralysis had started an hour ago, creeping down from his shoulder like ice water, stealing the sensation from his fingertips, then his forearm, and now his entire left side. He reached the sliding glass doors of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital. The automatic sensors triggered, and the doors hissed open, admitting a gust of freezing wind and the man who brought the cold in with him. The interior of the emergency room was a cacophony of human misery. Code Black, Trauma Team to Bay 1, Code Black. The overhead speakers blared the announcement on a loop, barely audible over the screaming. A multi-vehicle collision involving a city bus on Interstate 5 had turned the waiting room into a war zone. The air smelled of wet wool, copper blood, industrial antiseptic, and panic. Gurneys rushed by in a blur of motion. Doctors shouted orders that were swallowed by the din. Silas stepped into the chaos, and for a moment, the space around him seemed to warp. He did not rush. He did not look around with wide, frightened eyes like the other civilians. He stood completely still, water dripping from his coat onto the linoleum in a steady, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. He approached the reception desk. Behind the high counter sat Jason, a young intake coordinator who looked like he was barely out of high school. Jason had a thin neck, oversized scrubs that swallowed his frame, and a face pale with stress. He was frantically typing on a keyboard, juggling 2 phones. "Sir, you have to wait your turn," Jason said, without looking up, his voice cracking. "Unless you are bleeding out, take a number and sit." "I am not sitting," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was a low rumble, like a tank idling in a garage, but it cut through the screaming of the trauma ward with effortless authority. Jason looked up, annoyed. The annoyance died instantly in his throat. He saw the eyes. He saw the way the man was holding himself, rigid, vibrating with a tension that felt like a coiled spring. "Sir, your name?" Jason stammered. "Vance," Silas ground out. He reached into his pocket with his good right hand, ignoring the screaming protest of his ribs, and pulled out a crumpled ID card. He didn't hand it over. He slapped it onto the counter. "I need a consult, orthopedics, trauma, now." "Sir, we have a bus crash," Jason pleaded, his hands shaking. "The wait time is 6 hours. I need to process your insurance. I need to triage you." Silas leaned over the counter. The movement caused the color to drain from his face, turning his skin the shade of old parchment, but his expression remained stone. "I don't have 6 hours, son. I have shrapnel shifting in my subclavicular artery. It's pinching the brachial plexus. I am losing motor function. Silas spoke with clinical, detached precision. "I don't need insurance forms. I don't need a nurse to take my temperature. I need a mechanic. I need someone who knows the difference between a human body and a piece of meat. I... I can't..." Jason was hyperventilating. "Get me a surgeon," Silas growled. "Not a cosmetic doctor, someone who can weld." A nurse, a stout woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, noticed the confrontation. She stepped away from a patient with a broken arm and approached Silas. She reached out a hand to touch his good shoulder. "Sir, please lower your voice," she said soothingly. "You're in shock. Let me help you to a seat. We can get you a warm blanket and..." Silas flinched. It wasn't a subtle reaction. He jerked back as if her hand were a branding iron. His eyes widened, flashing with a sudden, feral intensity. "Don't touch me," he hissed. The nurse froze, hands raised. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need your help," Silas spat. In his mind, the white uniform didn't mean safety. It meant weakness. It meant the soft, pitying looks he had seen in Germany, in Walter Reed, in the faces of people who told him, "It's not your fault," while his team lay in flag-draped boxes. Softness killed. Comfort was a lie. He needed steel. He needed competence. "Stay away from me," Silas warned, his breathing becoming ragged. "All of you." In the corner of the waiting room, near a vending machine, a golden retriever named Scout was lying on a mat. Scout was a therapy dog, wearing a red vest that said, "Pet me." He was an animal of immense patience, trained to absorb the anxiety of weeping widows and frightened children. He had big, soulful brown eyes and fur the color of honey. Usually, amidst chaos, Scout was a rock. But as Silas backed away from the desk, Scout stood up. The dog did not bark. He did not wag his tail. He went rigid. The fur along the ridge of his back stood up in a razor-thin line. He lowered his head, his ears pinning back against his skull. He let out a sound, not a growl, but a low, vibrating hum deep in his chest. Scout ignored the screaming accident victims. His entire being was locked onto the large, soaking wet man standing by the desk. The dog sensed what the humans missed. This was not a prey animal seeking help. This was a predator that was hurt, and a hurt predator was the most dangerous thing on Earth. Silas turned away from the desk, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. The pain in his shoulder was no longer pain. It was a white noise that drowned out the world. He had to keep moving. If he stopped, he would fall. If he fell, he would die on this linoleum floor surrounded by civilians. He took a step toward the hallway leading to the surgical suites. "Sir, you can't go back there," Jason shouted. Then, a new figure stepped into his path. She did not run. She did not shout. She moved with the fluid, economized motion of someone who had walked through hell enough times to know the map. Evelyn Hart pushed an empty wheelchair into the center of the aisle. Evelyn was a woman in her mid-50s, though her eyes looked 1,000 years old. She was not physically imposing. She had a soft face, etched with fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and silver-streaked hair pulled back into a messy, practical bun. She wore faded blue scrubs that had seen too many washes, and a pair of reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She looked like a mother, or a favorite aunt, someone who baked cookies and knitted scarves. She parked the wheelchair directly in front of the hulking, swaying mass of Silas Vance. She locked the brakes with a sharp click. She didn't look at his ID. She didn't look at the reception desk. She looked at his left hand, limp and blue at his side. Then she looked up, meeting his terrifying gaze with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "Sit down, Colonel," Evelyn said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a strange weight, like a velvet-wrapped hammer. Silas stopped. He blinked, trying to clear the black spots dancing in his vision. He looked down at the small woman blocking his path. He saw the gray hair. He saw the softness of her jawline. He saw the faded scrubs. Disgust surged through him. Another barrier, another soft, civilian roadblock. "Move," Silas rasped. "You're going into neurogenic shock," Evelyn said, not moving an inch. "Your left pupil is blown. If you take another step, you're going to collapse. Sit in the chair." Silas laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. "I didn't walk out of the Korengal Valley to take orders from a grandmother." He leaned in close to her, using his height to intimidate. He smelled of rain, ozone, and old blood. Tran Ra, he growled, the foreign command slipping out before he switched back to English. Get out of my way. Go home, lady. Go make soup. Leave the dying to the men. The insult hung in the air, heavy and cruel. The young receptionist gasped. The other nurse looked horrified. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just watched him with those sad, knowing eyes. I'm not moving, she whispered. Then I'll go through you, Silas said. He surged forward. He tried to sidestep her, shifting his weight to his right leg to pivot around the wheelchair. It was a maneuver he had executed 1,000 times in combat, a simple redirection of momentum. But his body was no longer his own. As he shifted, the shrapnel inside him twisted. A bolt of agony, sharper than any knife, sheared through his chest. His right leg buckled. His equilibrium shattered. He didn't just stumble. He crashed. Silas Vance, the ghost, the legend of Delta Force, slammed into the corridor wall with the force of a falling tree. His bad shoulder took the impact. He let out a guttural sound that was half groan, half snarl. As he slid down the wall, his left hand dragged against the pristine white paint. He left a streak of bright, arterial blood on the wall, a jagged red signature marking his fall. He hit the floor hard, gasping for air, his vision tunneling down to a pinprick. Through the haze, he saw the blurry figure of the woman standing over him. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't panicking. She was simply reaching into her pocket, preparing to do exactly what he had forbidden. The darkness rose up to meet him, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas Vance couldn't fight it off. Gravity was a promise that Silas Vance had finally decided to keep. As his consciousness flickered like a dying bulb, the floor rushed up to meet him, a vast white expanse of linoleum that smelled of bleach and impending failure. He braced for the impact, the shattering of bone, the final humiliation of lying prone while strangers gawked. But the floor never came. Before his knees could hit the tiles, a force slammed into his side. It wasn't the gentle fluttering hands of a nurse trying to catch a falling giant. It was a hard, calculated impact of bone against bone. Evelyn Hart had moved with a speed that belied her age. She didn't try to catch him with her arms, which would have snapped under his dead weight. Instead, she stepped deep inside his falling arc, stomping her foot between his legs to create a fulcrum. She jammed her shoulder under his good armpit and locked her hip against his pelvis. It was not a hug. It was a structural intervention. It was the mechanics of a fireman's carry assist, modified for a discrepancy in weight class. A technique used to drag wounded soldiers out of kill zones when the rescuer is exhausted and the casualty is unconscious. Silas groaned, his head lolling onto her shoulder. He was heavy, a slab of dense muscle and wet tactical gear, but Evelyn absorbed the load into her legs, her face tightening with exertion, but not panic. She grunted once, a sharp exhale of air, and leveraged him upward, turning his fall into a controlled slide. "Walk with me, Marine," she hissed into his ear, her voice straining. "Right foot, move it, don't you dare die in the hallway." Silas, half blind with pain, responded to the command on an instinctual level deeper than thought. His legs, though trembling, obeyed the drill instructor tone. He shuffled forward, leaning heavily on the small woman who had somehow become a load-bearing wall. They moved together, a strange, stumbling two-headed beast, past the stunned onlookers. The silence in the corridor was broken only by the squeak of Evelyn's rubber clogs and the heavy, ragged breathing of the man she was hauling. A young man stepped into their path, his hands raised in a gesture of panic. Dr. Kenji Liu was a first-year intern who looked like he had been meticulously ironed before his shift. He had perfect jet-black hair, wire-rimmed glasses that were currently fogging up, and a stethoscope draped around his neck like a talisman of authority he didn't quite possess yet. He looked at the trail of blood on the wall, then at the terrifying figure of Silas, and finally at Evelyn. "Nurse Hart!" Liu's voice pitched up an octave. He fumbled for the radio clipped to his waist. "That man is violent. He's hemorrhaging and combative. I'm calling security. We need a code gray stat." Evelyn didn't stop moving. She steered Silas toward a set of double doors marked isolation. Authorized personnel only. "Put the radio away, Dr. Liu," Evelyn ordered, not even looking at him. She adjusted her grip on Silas's belt, hoisting him higher. "He assaulted the wall. He threatened the intake staff." Liu jogged alongside them, looking terrified. He could be armed. Protocol dictates we lock down the unit and wait for police. I'm calling 911. Evelyn stopped. The halt was so sudden that Silas swayed, nearly toppling them both. Evelyn braced her leg, steadying him, and turned her head to look at the intern. The look she gave him was terrifyingly devoid of emotion. It was the look of a triage officer deciding who lived and who died. "He isn't a criminal, Kenji," she said, her voice low and hard. "He is a bomb that is currently ticking down." She nodded toward the chaotic waiting room behind them. "If you call security, 2 overweight guards are going to try to tackle him. He will break their arms before he realizes what he's doing, even in this state. If you call the police, they will see a large, aggressive male refusing orders, and they will taser him. With his heart rate already arrhythmia bound from shock, a taser will kill him instantly." Liu's thumb hovered over the talk button. "But the protocol—" "Screw the protocol," Evelyn snapped. "Open room 4, now." Liu hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught between the rulebook and the sheer force of Evelyn's will. Then he scrambled ahead, swiping his badge over the sensor. The heavy door to room 4 hissed open. Room 4 was a soundproof isolation chamber designed for contagious diseases or psychiatric holds. It was stark, white, and windowless, with padded rails on the bed and bolted-down furniture. The air inside was still and smelled of ozone. Evelyn dragged Silas across the threshold. As soon as they were inside, she turned back to Liu. "Stay outside," she commanded. "Guard the door. Do not let anyone in, not security, not the attending. If anyone asks, I am performing a decontamination assessment." "Evelyn, if he hurts you," Liu whispered, his eyes wide. "He won't," she said, though she didn't believe it. "Just hold the line, doctor." She hit the button on the inside wall. The heavy door slid shut, sealing with a magnetic thud that cut off the noise of the hospital instantly. Silence slammed into the room. Evelyn didn't waste a second. She maneuvered Silas toward the trauma bed. "Sit," she ordered. But the transition to the quiet room seemed to have the opposite effect on Silas. The sudden lack of noise stripped away his external focus, leaving him alone with the screaming pain in his shoulder. The adrenaline that had sustained his march was curdling into toxic, paranoid aggression. He shoved her away. It was a clumsy, backhanded shove, but it had the weight of a sledgehammer behind it. Evelyn stumbled back, catching her balance against a metal supply cart. Silas stood in the center of the room, swaying like a drunkard. His face was gray, sweat pouring down his forehead in rivulets. His eyes were blown wide, pupils unequal, darting around the room, seeing enemies in the shadows of the medical equipment. "Where is he?" Silas roared. His voice bounced off the soundproof walls, raw and guttural. "Where is the surgeon?" "He's coming." Evelyn lied calmly, straightening her scrub top. She moved slowly, keeping her hands visible. "You need to sit down, Colonel. Your blood pressure is bottoming out." "Liar!" Silas turned on her. He wasn't seeing a nurse anymore. In the strobe light flashes of his memory, she was an interrogator. She was the enemy. "You're stalling. You're keeping me here until the extraction team leaves." He lunged for the door. Evelyn stepped into his path. "You can't go out there, Silas. Don't say my name." Silas swung his good arm. He didn't aim for her face. Some buried instinct prevented that, but he swept his arm across the metal instrument tray next to the bed. Crash. The sound was deafening in the small room. Stainless steel kidney basins, forceps, and scissors clattered across the floor. The tray itself spun through the air and slammed into the wall, missing Evelyn's head by inches. Silas stood panting, his chest heaving. "I told you," he gasped, saliva stringing from his lip. "I told you. I need a mechanic. Don't touch me. You people, you don't know how to fix this. You don't know how to treat a delta wound." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, fingers curled into a claw. He looked like a monster from a fever dream, soaking wet, blood-streaked, eyes wild with agony and rage. "You're too soft," he snarled, looming over her. "You'll break." Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She didn't scream for Dr. Liu. Instead, her body language changed. The grandmotherly posture vanished. Her shoulders squared, her center of gravity dropped. Her breathing synced with his. As Silas reached for her shoulder to shove her again, Evelyn moved. She didn't block him. She flowed around the strike. She dipped under his reaching arm, pivoting on her left heel with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a viper. In one smooth motion, she was behind him. Her right hand had already been in her pocket. Now it flashed upward. She held a preloaded syringe, a tactical dose of haloperidol and midazolam, a chemical takedown cocktail she had prepared the moment she saw him in the lobby. She didn't aim for the arm or the glute. Those muscles were too thick, too tense. She aimed for the neck. With her left arm, she hooked around his shoulder, pulling his head back slightly to expose the line of his throat. With her right, she drove the needle into the external jugular vein. It was a high-risk stick. A millimeter to the left, and she hits the carotid artery. A millimeter to the right, and she hits muscle. But her hand was steady as stone. Pop! She depressed the plunger in a single violent motion. Ugh! Silas grunted, slapping a hand to his neck. But it was too late. The cocktail hit his bloodstream directly, bypassing the slow absorption of intramuscular injection. Evelyn released him and stepped back, creating distance. She tossed the empty syringe into the sharps bin with a casual flick of her wrist. Silas spun around, staggering. He looked at her, betrayal and shock warring in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt like it was made of lead. His knees, which had been holding him up through sheer hatred, finally turned to water. You, he slurred, you stabbed me. He collapsed. This time, Evelyn caught him properly. She guided his massive frame down onto the trauma bed, lifting his legs and swinging them up. She quickly strapped the restraints across his chest and thighs, not to imprison him, but to keep him from thrashing when the nightmares came. Silas blinked up at the ceiling, the fight draining out of him as the drugs flooded his synapses. His breathing slowed, his eyelids fluttered. The lion was down. He looked at Evelyn, his vision tunneling. She stood over him, adjusting the IV line she was already preparing to insert. She looked terrifyingly competent. There was no softness in her face now, only the cold, hard efficiency of a professional who had done this 1,000 times in places much worse than Seattle. You're right, Evelyn whispered, leaning close to his ear as she swabbed his arm with alcohol. Her voice was as cold as the rain outside. I don't treat Delta wounds, Colonel. She slapped the vein in his arm to raise it, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I treat stubborn Delta operators. Silas tried to retort, tried to tell her she was fired, but the darkness rose up like a tide, soft and merciful, and pulled him under. The drug did not bring sleep. Sleep was a mercy, a soft black void where the mind could rest. The chemical cocktail Evelyn had injected did not offer mercy. It offered a cage. Silas felt the paralysis hit his limbs first, a heavy, suffocating blanket of lead. But his mind, fueled by 3 days of adrenaline and 20 years of trauma, refused to go dark. Instead, it fractured. The walls of the isolation room dissolved, melting away like wax under a blowtorch, and the sterile white light of the hospital ceiling shifted, yellowing, hardening, until it became the blistering sun of the Syrian desert. He was no longer in Seattle. The smell of antiseptic and rain vanished, replaced instantly by the copper tang of blood, the sulfur of cordite, and the sickeningly sweet scent of burning diesel. The temperature spiked. He could feel the sweat instantly flash boiling on his skin. The air was full of dust, a gritty, choking powder that coated his tongue. Ghost! We're pinned! 3 o'clock high! The voice screamed in his headset. It was Miller, Lieutenant Miller. He sounded young, terrified, and alive. Silas tried to move, to roll into cover behind the crumbled concrete of the safe house, but he couldn't. His arms were heavy. Something was holding him down. He looked down at his wrists. They weren't bound by hospital restraints. They were pinned under the wreckage of a collapsed HESCO barrier. Boom! The ground shook. In reality, outside the walls of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital, a massive thunderclap rattled the window panes. The storm had moved directly overhead, unleashing a fury of electricity. In Silas's mind, that thunder was not weather. It was a 120mm mortar round impacting 20 meters to his left. The concussion wave hit him in the chest. He gasped, sucking in air that felt like broken glass. The pain in his left shoulder, the real physical pain of the shifting shrapnel, translated seamlessly into the nightmare. In the dream, a sniper's bullet had just torn through his clavicle, shattering the bone and pinning him to the dirt. He thrashed, his body arching off the mattress. Evelyn Hart stood over the monitor, her brow furrowed in concentration. The room was dim, lit only by the green glow of the cardiac display and the occasional flash of lightning from the hallway window strip. The silence she had enforced was now filled with the erratic, rhythmic beeping of the EKG. Beep, 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 beep. "Come on, Silas," she whispered, her hands moving deftly to adjust the sensors on his chest. "Don't do this. Don't go into VTOSH on me." The monitor was showing a premature ventricular contraction, PVC. His heart was irritated, firing chaotic electrical signals. It wasn't just the shock, it was the pain. Evelyn looked down at his shoulder. The bruising had spread significantly in the last 10 minutes. It was a deep, angry purple, mottling the skin from his neck to his bicep. But what terrified her wasn't the color. It was the shape. Just beneath the skin, near the junction of the neck and shoulder, there was a hard lump. It was the shrapnel. It had migrated. Every time Silas twitched in his drug-induced delirium, the metal fragment sawed against the brachial plexus, the superhighway of nerves controlling the arm. Worse, it was millimeter close to the subclavian artery. If he thrashed too hard, if he torqued his body the wrong way, the metal would act like a razor blade inside a balloon. "I need to stabilize this," she muttered to herself. She reached for a roll of heavy gauze and a splint, intending to immobilize his arm completely. She leaned over him, her face inches from his, her breathing steady despite the rising panic in the room. Outside, the storm intensified. Another crack of thunder, louder than the last, shook the floorboards. To Silas, the thunder was the sound of the safe house roof collapsing. The dust swirled. Through the haze, a figure loomed over him. It wasn't Evelyn. The woman with the kind eyes and the graying hair was gone. In her place stood a shadow, a figure wrapped in a black keffiyeh, face obscured, holding a device, an interrogator. Silas knew this demon. He had met her in the black sites of his memory. She wasn't here to help. She was here to finish the job. She was reaching for his neck, reaching for the kill spot. He felt her hands on him, cold, clinical, probing his wound. "She's finding the nerve," his mind screamed. "She's going to sever it. She's going to make you talk." "Get off," Silas mumbled, the words slurring through the sedatives. Evelyn didn't hear the threat. She heard a groan of pain. She leaned closer, her hand brushing his forehead to check his temperature. "Shh, it's okay. I've got you. Stay still." To Silas, the voice was distorted, a low, mocking garble. "Stay still. Let me cut you." The survival instinct is a primitive thing. It resides in the lizard brain, beneath logic, beneath language, beneath even the heaviest sedation. When the predator touches the throat, the prey reacts. But Silas Vance was not prey. Adrenaline dumped into his system, a massive toxic wave that burned through the chemical fog of the haloperidol. His heart rate spiked. 140, 160, 180. The soft leather restraints of a civilian hospital were designed to keep confused geriatric patients from pulling out their IVs. They were not designed to hold a Tier 1 operator who believed he was fighting for his life. Silas roared. It was a sound of pure animalistic fury. He wrenched his right arm, his good arm, upward with a violence that defied physics. Snap. The leather strap didn't just break. The metal buckle sheared off the bed frame with a screech of tearing steel. Evelyn gasped, pulling back. But she wasn't fast enough. Silas didn't strike her. Not yet. His focus was tactical. He needed a weapon. His eyes, wide and unseeing, locked onto the metal tray table Evelyn had set back up. There, gleaming in the green light of the monitor, was a disposable scalpel she had laid out to cut the heavy gauze. He moved in a blur. He ripped the restraint off his left wrist, ignoring the agony that tore through his shoulder like a lightning bolt, and swung his legs off the bed. He hit the floor, stumbling, his equilibrium shot, but his momentum carried him forward. Evelyn shouted, "Silas, stop! Look at me!" He didn't see Evelyn. He saw the enemy. He lunged. He caught her by the throat. His hand was large enough to encompass her entire neck. He didn't squeeze. He slammed. He drove her backward, his momentum carrying them both across the small room until her back hit the padded wall with a bone-rattling thud. Evelyn's vision starred. The air left her lungs in a whoosh. She tried to bring her hands up to break his grip, but he was too strong, too heavy. He pinned her there, his body weight pressing her into the vinyl padding. And then, the cold bite of steel. Silas held the scalpel in his right hand. He pressed the blade against the soft hollow of her neck, right over the carotid artery. He didn't cut, not yet, but the pressure was there. One twitch, one sneeze, and she would bleed out in 30 seconds. His face was inches from hers. His pupils were blown so wide, his eyes looked entirely black. Sweat dripped from his nose onto her cheek. He smelled of fear and violence. "Kai Mao!" he screamed, the Vietnamese slipping out again, a ghost from his father's war that haunted his own lexicon. Then, switching to a guttural, broken English. "Where are they?" Evelyn stared up at him. She couldn't breathe. She could feel the pulse of the blade against her skin. She could see the madness swirling in his eyes. "Tell me," Silas bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "Where is my unit? Where is Miller?" The thunder outside boomed again, a long, rolling growl that sounded like the end of the world. Inside the room, the only sound was the frantic screaming alarm of the cardiac monitor, flatlining in its connection to the man who was currently holding death against Evelyn's throat. Silas's hand trembled. The blade nicked her skin. A single bead of red blood welled up, bright and terrifying against her pale neck. "Answer me," he whispered, his voice cracking, "or I will paint this wall with you." The distance between life and death is often measured in millimeters. In room 4 of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital, that distance was currently the width of a disposable carbon steel blade pressing against the jugular vein of Evelyn Hart. The room was suffocatingly small. The padded walls seemed to lean in, trapping the smell of fear and ozone. Outside, the storm had reached its crescendo, the thunder cracking like artillery fire, shaking the foundation of the building. But inside the circle of Silas Vance's madness, there was only the sound of ragged, wet breathing. Silas did not see a middle-aged nurse. His pupils were blown so wide they swallowed the iris, turning his eyes into twin tunnels of infinite darkness. He was looking at a ghost, a demon from the Idlib province, a faceless tormentor who had come to finish what the war had started. His hand, thick with muscle and scarred from a lifetime of violence, trembled. The blade nicked the skin. A single bead of blood, bright and terrible, rolled down Evelyn's neck and disappeared into the collar of her scrub top. "Kai Mao!" Silas screamed again, the veins in his neck bulging like ropes. "Where is the extraction point?" Evelyn could feel the heat radiating off him. He was burning up, his body temperature spiking from the infection and the overdose of adrenaline. She knew the physiology of violence better than anyone. She knew that if she struggled, if she flinched, if she begged, his predator brain would react before his conscious mind could intervene. He would slice her throat not out of malice, but out of reflex. So Evelyn Hart did the impossible. She relaxed. She forced the muscles in her shoulders to drop. She uncoiled the tension in her legs. She looked past the blade, past the madness, and locked her eyes onto his. Her gaze was not pleading. It was not fearful. It was an anchor dropped into a raging sea. She took a breath. It was a shallow, controlled sip of air. When she spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. The soft, melodic tone of the civilian nurse was gone. In its place was a voice made of gravel and steel, a voice that had shouted over the rotor wash of Black Hawks and the screams of dying men. "Alpha 6. Actual," she said. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. Silas blinked. The hand holding the scalpel froze. The tremor in his arm intensified, fighting against the sudden intrusion of structured language. Evelyn did not stop. She pitched her voice to cut through the roar of the thunder outside, matching the cadence of a radio transmission. "This is Dustoff Niner," she continued, her eyes boring into his. Coordinates 3440, Kime border sector. Silas's breath hitched. His mouth opened slightly, a soundless gasp escaping his throat. The reality of the hospital room began to flicker at the edges of his vision. The white walls were vibrating. Lieutenant Miller is KIA, Evelyn recited, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Repeat, Miller is gone. We are pinned down, taking effective fire from the North Ridge, requesting immediate extraction. Over. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. For Silas, the world tilted on its axis. The voice. It wasn't the voice of an interrogator. It wasn't the voice of a nurse. It was a sound he had chased for 5 years in the bottom of whiskey bottles and the dark corners of sleepless nights. It was the voice that had crackled over his encrypted comms channel when the world was ending. It was the voice of the only person who had stayed behind when the rest of the world ran away. The dust-off pilot, the medic, the ghost of Kime. The scalpel slipped. It didn't cut her. His fingers, suddenly devoid of strength, simply opened. Clang. The metal instrument hit the linoleum floor, the sound echoing like a church bell. Silas stumbled back. He looked at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He looked at the woman leaning against the padded wall, rubbing her neck where the blood was beginning to dry. You, Silas whispered. The word was a shards of glass in his throat. The radio, the interference. I never saw your face. No, Evelyn said softly. She stepped away from the wall. She didn't move toward the door to escape. She moved toward him. You didn't. The dust was too thick. And by the time the bird landed, you were already unconscious. Silas shook his head, the cognitive dissonance tearing him apart. You're a nurse. You're a civilian. You make soup. I make soup now, Evelyn corrected him. But I didn't always. She reached for the sleeve of her left arm. Her movements were slow, ceremonial. She unbuttoned the cuff of her white thermal undershirt. She began to roll the fabric up, inch by inch, exposing the skin of her forearm. Silas watched, mesmerizing. The skin was not smooth. From the wrist to the elbow, the flesh was a ruin of scar tissue, shiny, puckered, and white. It was the distinct melted topography of a phosphorus burn. It was the kind of scar you got when you reached into a burning Humvee to pull a man out before the fuel tank blew. But it was what lay in the center of the burn that stopped Silas's heart. Inked directly over the deepest part of the scar, defying the damage to the skin, was a masterpiece of black and gray work. It was a dagger, the distinct double-edged Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife of the special operations community. But the blade wasn't piercing flesh. It was driven through the center of a black rose, and wrapped around the rose, binding it tight, was a coil of razor wire. Beneath the image, in fading Gothic script, was the Latin creed, Non sibi sed patriae, not for self, but for country. And below that, a set of numbers. The date, 11/04/2018. The day his team died. Silas stared at the ink. He knew that tattoo. He didn't know the bearer, but he knew the legend. He knew about the Shadow Medical Unit, Joint Special Operations Command's surgical ghosts, the ones who didn't exist, the ones who dropped into places where the American flag wasn't supposed to be. Delta, surgical, Silas breathed, his knees finally giving way. He slumped against the trauma bed, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the debris of his outburst. Evelyn finished rolling up her sleeve. She left it exposed, a badge of honor and horror. She walked over to him. She didn't kneel like a nurse comforting a patient. She stood over him, placing a hand on his good shoulder. The grip was firm. It was heavy. It was the grip of an officer acknowledging a subordinate. "Stand down, Silas," she commanded. Her voice cracked, just a fraction, revealing the woman beneath the soldier. Silas looked up at her, tears streaming freely down his face, mixing with the sweat and grime. The rage was gone, drained away, leaving only a hollow, aching grief that was vast enough to swallow the ocean. "I left him," Silas choked out. "I left Miller. I gave the order to pull back." "You secured the perimeter," Evelyn said firmly. She squeezed his shoulder. "You held the line so the bird could land. You didn't leave him, Colonel. You gave him to me." She knelt then, bringing her face level with his. She reached out and took his trembling hand, the one that had held the knife seconds ago, and pressed it against the scar on her arm. She let him feel the raised ridges of the ink, the history carved into her skin. "I was there," she whispered. "I held the artery. I listened to his last words. He didn't die alone in the dirt, Silas. He died looking at this tattoo. He died knowing you got the rest of the boys out." Silas shuddered, a violent full-body sob that seemed to crack his ribs. He said my name? He said, 'Tell Ghost not to follow me yet.'" Evelyn lied, or perhaps she told the truth. In the chaos of that day, memory was a kaleidoscope. He said, "Tell him to finish the mission." The storm outside raged on, but inside room 4, the war had finally paused. Evelyn shifted her grip, moving her hand to the back of his neck, pulling his forehead to rest against her shoulder. It was a breach of every protocol in the hospital handbook. It was unsanitary, unprofessional, and dangerous. And it was the only medicine that could save him. "The war is over, Silas," she murmured into his hair as he wept, his massive body shaking against her small frame. "I brought Miller home, and now I'm going to bring you home. But you have to let go of the knife. You have to let go of the desert." Silas nodded against her shoulder, his breathing hitching. "I'm tired, Evelyn. God, I'm so tired." "I know," she said, rocking him slightly. "I know. Peace is a heavy thing." For 5 years, Silas Vance had carried the weight of war, a crushing, screaming burden of guilt and noise. Now, sitting on the floor of isolation room 4, leaning against the woman who had just pulled him back from the edge of insanity, that weight had vanished. But the sudden absence of the burden left him dizzy, lightheaded, and terrifyingly vulnerable. He sat with his head resting against Evelyn's shoulder, his breath hitching in wet, ragged gasps. The tears had stopped, leaving tracks through the grime on his face, but the shaking in his hands remained. It was the adrenaline dump, the inevitable crash that follows a biological surge. "Breathe, Colonel," Evelyn whispered, her hand still resting on the back of his neck, her fingers tangled in his rough hair. "Just breathe. You're back. You're here." Silas tried to obey. He tried to draw a deep, cleansing breath to fill his lungs and steady his racing heart. But the air didn't come. It started as a hitch, a sharp stabbing catch in the left side of his chest, right beneath the collarbone. Silas frowned, his brow furrowing in the dim light. He tried again, expanding his diaphragm, willing the oxygen to flow. Nothing. It felt as though someone had placed a heavy stone on the left side of his rib cage. He inhaled, but the breath was shallow, empty, and unsatisfying. "Evelyn," Silas wheezed. The name came out as a gargle. Evelyn stiffened, her nurse's instinct, honed in the triage tents of Anbar and the trauma bays of Seattle, overrode the emotional moment instantly. She pulled back, gripping his shoulders, and looked at his face. In the green glow of the cardiac monitor, Silas looked like a corpse. His skin, which had been flushed with rage moments ago, was now a sickly, mottled gray. His lips were turning a distinct, terrifying shade of blue. "Silas?" She placed a hand on his chest. "Can't..." Silas gasped, clutching at his throat. His eyes bulged, panic replacing the grief. "Can't... get... air." Evelyn's eyes dropped to his neck. The veins in his neck, the jugulars, were distended, roping out like thick cords against his skin. Jugular venous distension. JVD. She looked at his throat. His trachea, the windpipe that should have been centered, was shifted. It was deviated visibly to the right, pushed away from the injury. "Oh, God!" Evelyn hissed. The shrapnel. In his violent struggle, in the thrashing and the lunging and the slamming against the wall, the jagged piece of Soviet-era metal inside his shoulder had finally done what it was threatening to do for hours. It hadn't just nicked a vessel. It had sliced through the pleura, the airtight sac surrounding the lung. Every time Silas gasped for air, he was sucking oxygen into the chest cavity, but not into the lung. The air was trapped, building up pressure with every breath, crushing the left lung, pushing the heart and the great vessels to the right. Tension pneumothorax. It was a kill shot. The pressure would kink the vena cava, stopping blood flow to the heart. He didn't have minutes. He had seconds. Silas, listen to me, Evelyn said, her voice snapping into command mode. Your lung has collapsed. The pressure is crushing your heart. I need to... Boom! The sound was not thunder. It was an explosion. A blinding flash of white light turned the window strip in the door into a square of pure magnesium fire. The building shook so violently that the IV pole rattled against the bed frame. Lightning, a direct hit. Somewhere in the basement of the hospital, a massive breaker blew with a sound like a gunshot. The lights in room 4 flickered, once, twice, and then died. The cardiac monitor, which had been screaming its alarm, went silent. The hum of the ventilation system cut out. The electronic lock on the door disengaged with a dull clunk. Darkness. Absolute suffocating ink-black darkness swallowed the room. The hospital's backup generators were supposed to kick in within 10 seconds, but the lightning strike had fried the main transfer switch. 10 seconds passed. 20. Nothing. Evelyn? Silas's voice was a wet rasp in the dark. He was drowning on dry land. Evelyn didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who could see. She reached into the deep cargo pocket of her scrub pants. She didn't pull out a phone. She pulled out a cylinder of anodized aluminum, a surefire tactical flashlight, battered and scratched, a relic she had carried since 2018. Click, a beam of piercing white light, 500 lumens strong, cut through the blackness. It didn't illuminate the whole room. It sliced it into stark sections of light and shadow. The beam landed on Silas. He was slumping against the bed frame, his head lolling back. He was fighting for every molecule of oxygen, his chest heaving uselessly. His eyes rolled back in his head. "Stay with me," Evelyn shouted. She swept the light across the room. She needed a needle, a decompression needle, a 14-gauge angiocath, at least 3 inches long, but the crash cart was outside. Dr. Liu was outside, and the electronic door was heavy, manual override only. By the time she dragged it open and found the cart in the pitch-black hallway, Silas would be in cardiac arrest. She had to use what was in the room. Her light swept across the debris on the floor, the mess Silas had made in his rage. Kidney basins, bandages, forceps. There. Gleaming in the dust near the wall was the IV start kit she had dropped earlier. It contained an 18-gauge needle. It was too small. It was meant for veins, not for punching through chest muscle and releasing pressurized air. She looked frantically at the supply shelf. Top shelf. A sealed package. Spinal needle. 20-gauge. Too thin. Middle shelf. Bone marrow aspiration kit. Too complex. Then she saw it. On the bottom shelf, in a sterile peel pack meant for emergency airway access. A 14-gauge catheter over needle. Thick, long, brutal. Evelyn lunged for it, holding the flashlight in her teeth. She ripped the package open. Outside the door, the silence of the power outage was broken by a sound that made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. Scout. The therapy dog was no longer just whining. He was barking, a high-pitched, frantic, rhythmic bark. He was scratching at the heavy door, his claws scrabbling against the laminate. Dogs know the smell of death. They smell the chemical shift in the air when a body begins to shut down. Scout wasn't trying to get in. He was trying to wake the dead. "I hear you, buddy," Evelyn mumbled around the flashlight. "I'm working on it." She scrambled back to Silas. He was fading. His hands, which had been gripping his knees, were now limp. His struggle for air had slowed to shallow, agonizing sips. The pressure in his chest was so great that his heart couldn't fill with blood between beats. Obstructive shock. Evelyn knelt beside him. She placed the flashlight on the floor, aiming it upward so the beam cast eerie, long shadows across his torso. She ripped his wet t-shirt down the middle. The fabric tore easily. She looked at his chest. The left side was distended, swollen and unmoving. The right side was heaving. She had to find the spot. Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line. In a sterile trauma bay with lights and ultrasound, this was a routine procedure. In the dark, on the floor, with a dying man, it was a gamble. She used her fingers. She felt the collarbone, the clavicle. She walked her fingers down. First rib, the space below it. Second rib, the space below that. "Silas," she said. Her voice was steady. Silas, can you hear me? Silas's eyelids fluttered. He couldn't speak. He couldn't nod. He could only look at her. In the harsh uplight of the flashlight, his eyes were glassy. I have to decompress your chest, Evelyn said. I don't have lidocaine. I don't have time to numb it. This is going to hurt like hell, but it's going to save you. She took his hand, his massive calloused hand, and pressed it against her leg. Squeeze my leg when it hurts, she ordered. Don't fight me. Silas's fingers twitched against her thigh. It was a weak signal, but it was there. A signal of absolute trust. Do it. Evelyn uncapped the 14-gauge needle. It looked enormous in the spotlight. 3 inches of steel designed to pierce deep. She located the landmark again, right above the 3rd rib, to avoid the nerve bundle below the 2nd. 1, Evelyn counted. 2. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation causes tissue damage. Hesitation kills. 3. She drove the needle down. She felt the resistance of the skin, tough, leathery skin of a soldier. Pop. She felt the resistance of the pectoral muscle. Pop. She felt the grit of the intercostal muscle. Silas's body bucked. His back arched off the floor. His grip on her leg tightened so hard she felt a bruise forming instantly. He made a sound that wasn't a scream, but a guttural grunt of pure agony trapped behind clenched teeth. Evelyn didn't stop. She pushed deeper, aiming for the pleural space. And then the resistance vanished. The sound was loud, unmistakable, and beautiful. It sounded like a truck tire being slashed. It was the sound of air, trapped, pressurized, killing air, rushing out of Silas's chest through the hollow needle. Evelyn pulled the metal needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place. The hiss continued for 5 seconds. 6 seconds. 7. And then Silas took a breath. It was a gasp, deep and shuddering. His chest wall fell. The pressure on his heart released. Blood flooded back into his right atrium. His color, gray and ghostly in the flashlight beam, began to pinken almost instantly. He coughed, a wet, hacking cough that cleared his airway. There, Evelyn whispered, her hands shaking now that it was done. She taped the catheter down with a piece of the torn shirt and some medical tape from her pocket. There, breathe. Silas slumped back against the bed frame, panting. He looked down at the plastic tube sticking out of his chest, then up at Evelyn. The flashlight beam caught her face. She looked exhausted. Her hair was coming loose, strands sticking to her sweaty forehead. There was a smear of his blood on her cheek. In the dark, she didn't look like a nurse. She looked like a Valkyrie. Silas reached out. His hand was weak, but steady. He touched the hand that had just stabbed him. You, he rasped, his voice raw but full of air. You carry a surefire in your scrubs? Evelyn let out a laugh, a short hysterical burst of relief. She picked up the flashlight and shone it on the ceiling, diffusing the light so it wasn't so harsh. Old habits, she said, her voice trembling. They die hard. Good habit, Silas murmured, closing his eyes. Good habit. Outside the door, Scout stopped barking. The dog let out a low, satisfied whine and settled down against the frame. He knew. The smell of death had receded. In the silence of the blackout, surrounded by the wreckage of the room and the storm outside, Silas Vance and Evelyn Hart sat in the dark, breathing in unison. The line between life and death had been crossed, and she had dragged him back to the right side. The morning sun did not break through the gray blanket of Seattle. It merely turned the charcoal sky a lighter shade of slate, illuminating the sterile, hushed world of the intensive care unit. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Vance was alive. He lay in bed 3, a monolith of a man dwarfing the narrow hospital mattress. The angry purple bruising on his shoulder had faded slightly, and the frantic gasping of the night before had been replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of oxygen flowing through a nasal cannula. A neat, sterile dressing taped to his chest covered the hole where Evelyn had punched a 14-gauge needle through his ribs. He was sedated, drifting in a dreamless void, his heart beating a strong, steady rhythm on the monitor above him. He was safe. Evelyn Hart was not. 5 floors up, in the executive wing of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital, the air smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee, the scent of bureaucracy. Evelyn sat at the end of a long mahogany conference table. She wore her civilian clothes, a simple navy sweater and gray slacks. Her hands were folded on the table, still and composed, though the knuckles were white. At the head of the table sat Director Marcus Caldwell. Caldwell was a man who had built a career on minimizing risk. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Evelyn's car, and his silver hair was coiffed into a helmet of perfection. He looked at Evelyn not with anger, but with the weary disappointment of a man who was calculating insurance premiums in his head. To his right sat the hospital's chief legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Sterling, who was tapping a stylus against a tablet screen. To his left was the director of nursing, who refused to meet Evelyn's eyes. "Ms. Hart," Caldwell began, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "We have reviewed the incident report from last night. We have the logs from the cardiac monitor in room 4. We have Dr. Liu's statement regarding your refusal to allow security intervention." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of the timeline. "You administered a Class 4 sedative without a physician's order," Caldwell listed, ticking off the sins. "You barricaded a patient in an isolation room, and, most egregiously, you performed a needle thoracostomy, a surgical procedure, on a patient in a non-combat environment. You are a nurse, Ms. Hart. You are not a trauma surgeon." "The patient had a tension pneumothorax," Evelyn said quietly. "The power was out. The electronic locks were engaged. He would have been dead in 60 seconds. "That is speculation," Ms. Sterling interjected, not looking up from her tablet. "What is fact is that you pierced a patient's chest wall with a non-standard device in an unsterile environment." Caldwell leaned forward, clasping his hands. "But there is something else, Evelyn. The state of the room." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. "Security found room 4 destroyed," Caldwell said, his eyes narrowing. "Restraints sheared off the metal frame, instrument trays embedded in the drywall, and a scalpel found on the floor." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Dr. Liu mentioned the patient was aggressive before entering the room. Did Colonel Vance attack you, Ms. Hart? Did he threaten you with that weapon?" The room went deadly silent. If Evelyn said yes, if she told the truth that Silas had held a blade to her throat in a psychotic fugue state, the hospital would be absolved of liability. But Silas Vance would be finished. A violent assault on medical staff would trigger a mandatory psychiatric discharge. He would lose his command, he would lose his clearance, he would be labeled unstable, a danger to society. The ghost would be exorcised from the military he had bled for. Evelyn looked at the polished wood of the table. She thought of the tattoo on her arm. She thought of Miller dying in the dirt. She thought of Silas weeping on her shoulder. She looked up, meeting Caldwell's gaze with absolute steadiness. "No," Evelyn lied. "No." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "The patient was thrashing due to pain," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "I attempted to restrain him, but I underestimated his strength. The equipment was faulty. The scalpel fell when I knocked the tray over in the dark." "So, the destruction of the room was—" "My failure to manage the patient's environment," Evelyn said. "I panicked. I lost control of the scene. The colonel was confused, but he was not violent toward me. I take full responsibility for the chaos." Ms. Sterling stopped tapping her stylus. She looked at Evelyn with a mixture of suspicion and surprise. By taking the blame for the chaos, Evelyn was effectively painting herself as incompetent to save a soldier's career. Caldwell sat back, looking relieved. Incompetence was easier to handle than a homicidal war hero. "Very well," Caldwell sighed. "Ms. Hart, given the severity of the protocol violations, specifically the unauthorized surgery, we have no choice. The board is terminating your employment, effective immediately. We will also be reporting this incident to the State Nursing Board for license review." He pushed a termination letter across the table. "Please surrender your badge and clear out your locker." The locker room in the basement was quiet. Evelyn opened locker 304. It was empty except for a spare pair of scrubs, a box of tea, and a framed photo of her old unit, faces that were mostly gone now. She packed her life into a small cardboard box. It didn't take long. 15 years at this hospital, thousands of patients, and it all fit into a box the size of a toaster. "Evelyn?" She turned. Dr. Kenji Liu stood in the doorway. The young intern looked devastated. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he was wringing his hands. "I tried to tell them," Liu choked out. "I told them the power was out. I told them you saved him. They didn't care." Evelyn smiled sadly. She walked over and straightened the collar of his white coat. "It's okay, Kenji," she said softly. "They are administrators. They see liability. You are a doctor. You saw a life. Never lose that." "It's not fair," Liu whispered, a tear escaping. "You're the best nurse in this building." "The world isn't fair, doctor. You learned that last night." Evelyn picked up her box. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her ID badge. She placed it gently on the bench next to her folded white coat. "Take care of him," Evelyn said, nodding toward the ceiling, toward the ICU. "When he wakes up, tell him the operation was a success. Don't tell him about this." "Evelyn, goodbye, Kenji." She walked out of the locker room, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, leaving the weeping intern behind. Seattle lived up to its reputation. By the time Evelyn reached the main exit, the sky had opened up again. It wasn't the violent storm of the previous night, but a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked into the bones. Evelyn pushed through the revolving doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. She took a deep breath of the wet air. She was 54 years old. She was a widow. She was unemployed. And for the first time in a decade, she felt completely untethered. She adjusted the cardboard box in her arms and began the long walk to the employee parking lot. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead. She didn't have an umbrella. It seemed fitting. She walked past the manicured hedges, past the bronze statue of a generic soldier saluting a generic flag. She felt a profound sense of hollowness. The adrenaline was gone. The purpose was gone. She was just a civilian now, in every sense of the word. Screech. The sound of tires tearing against wet asphalt shattered her solitude. Evelyn stopped. 3 black SUVs, massive Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows and reinforced grille guards, swerved around the corner of the hospital entrance. They didn't drive like civilians. They drove in a tight, aggressive formation, moving as a single predatory organism. They cut across the lanes, ignoring the traffic signs, and screeched to a halt directly in front of her, forming a blockade that cut off her path to the parking lot. Evelyn didn't run. She shifted her box to one arm and slipped her free hand into her pocket, gripping the tactical flashlight. Old habits. The doors of the lead and rear vehicles flew open simultaneously. 6 men stepped out. They were not police. They were not hospital security. They wore expensive black suits that were cut to hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. They had earpieces, Oakley sunglasses despite the rain, and the distinct coiled posture of men who were used to violence. They fanned out, creating a perimeter around Evelyn, pushing back a curious pedestrian who had stopped to look. The rear door of the middle SUV opened more slowly. A man stepped out. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair cropped close and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from flint. He wore a trench coat over a suit and a lapel pin that caught the gray light, a small golden triangle. He walked straight up to Evelyn, ignoring the rain that instantly darkened the shoulders of his coat. He looked at the cardboard box in her arms. He looked at the ID badge missing from her chest. Then he looked at her face. "Mrs. Hart?" the man asked. His voice was gravelly and precise. "That depends on who's asking," Evelyn said, her grip tightening on the flashlight. The man gave a rare, microscopic smile. "My name is Agent Sterling, Department of Defense." "I'm retired, Agent," Evelyn said coldly. "And as of 10 minutes ago, I'm fired. So if you'll excuse me—" "We know," Sterling interrupted. "We monitored the board hearing." Evelyn froze. "You monitored?" "We have ears everywhere, Lieutenant." He used her old rank. "Especially when it concerns assets like Colonel Vance." Sterling stepped closer, invading her personal space. He lowered his voice so the wind wouldn't carry it. "The colonel woke up 10 minutes ago," Sterling said. "He asked for the dust-off nurse. When Dr. Liu told him you had been terminated and sent away." Sterling paused, looking toward the hospital windows high above. "Let's just say the colonel is extremely displeased. He threatened to pull his IVs out and crawl down here himself if we didn't retrieve you." Evelyn blinked. "Retrieve me?" "You're not going to your car, Mrs. Hart," Sterling said, gesturing to the open door of the armored SUV. The interior looked warm, lined with leather and satellite communication gear. "Your clearance has been reactivated," Sterling said. "Get in the car. We have a lot of work to do, and the ghost doesn't like to wait." The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, but it was a silence that screamed. Evelyn Hart stood in the center of the stainless steel box, her cardboard box of personal effects still clutched in her arms like a shield. Flanking her were Agent Sterling and two of the men from the SUVs. They didn't look at her. They scanned the floor numbers as they ticked upward, their bodies coiled springs of professional violence. Evelyn felt a strange dislocation. 10 minutes ago, she had been a discarded employee, a liability to be erased. Now, she was being escorted like a head of state, or a high-value prisoner. "Agent Sterling," Evelyn said, staring at the reflection of the doors. "He shouldn't be moving. He still has a chest tube in." "We know," Sterling said, his eyes fixed on the display panel. "The doctors tried to sedate him again. He told them if they came near him with a needle, he'd break their fingers. He insisted on attending the meeting." "The meeting is over," Evelyn said. "I was fired." "The meeting," Sterling corrected her, as the doors slid open with a soft chime, "is just beginning." The executive corridor of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital was usually a sanctuary of hushed voices and soft footsteps. Today, it felt like a staging area. As they approached the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, Evelyn saw them, 5 men. They were not wearing suits like the agents. They were dressed in what could only be described as off-duty operator attire, flannel shirts that were too tight across the shoulders, cargo pants, and boots that had seen foreign soil. They ranged in age from 30 to 60, a multi-generational spectrum of warfare. They stood guard outside the boardroom doors, arms crossed, staring down the terrified receptionist. As Evelyn approached, the oldest of the group, a man with a thick white mustache and the posture of a command sergeant major, snapped to attention. He didn't salute. That would have been too formal. Instead, he simply nodded, a slow, deep gesture of absolute respect. "Ma'am," he rumbled. Evelyn recognized him. Ramirez, 2004, Fallujah. She had packed his abdominal wound with combat gauze while mortars rained down on their triage tent. He was supposed to be dead. "Ramirez," she whispered. "Good to see you, Lieutenant Hart," he said, his eyes crinkling. He reached out and gently took the cardboard box from her hands. "I'll hold this. You won't need it where you're going." He turned and kicked the boardroom doors open. Inside, the atmosphere of self-congratulatory relief shattered instantly. Director Caldwell was halfway through a sip of sparkling water. Ms. Sterling, the legal counsel, was packing her briefcase. They both froze as the doors banged against the walls. "What is the meaning of this?" Caldwell sputtered, standing up. "Security! I said no interruptions." "Sit down, Marcus," a voice commanded from the doorway. It wasn't Silas. The voice was smooth, polished, and carried the weight of Capitol Hill. Into the room walked, or rather, pushed, a nightmare for any hospital administrator. Pushing a heavy-duty tactical transport wheelchair was Senator Harlan Thorne. Thorne was a household name, the chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, a man who controlled billions of dollars in funding. But before he was a senator, he had been a Green Beret. He wore a 3-piece suit, but he moved with the predatory grace of a jungle fighter. And in the chair sat the ghost. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Vance looked terrible. His skin was the color of wet ash. A sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead, and his breath hissed through his teeth with every bump of the wheels. An IV pole was clamped to the back of the chair, the saline bag swaying rhythmically. He was wearing his hospital gown, but someone, likely Ramirez, had draped his camouflage field jacket over his shoulders like a cape. He looked like a dying king returning to his throne to pass one final sentence. The 5 veterans filed in behind them, lining the back wall. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Senator Thorne?" Caldwell's face went white. He dropped his water glass. It tipped over, soaking the polished mahogany table, but no one moved to clean it up. We weren't expecting..." "Clearly," Thorne said, parking the wheelchair at the head of the table. He didn't sit. He stood behind Silas, his hands resting protectively on the handles. You were too busy firing the most overqualified medical asset in the entire Department of Defense. Silas raised his head. The movement clearly cost him agony. The muscles in his neck corded with the effort. His eyes, dark and burning with a feverish intensity, locked onto Caldwell. "You fired her?" Silas rasped. His voice was weak, but it silenced the room like a gunshot. "Colonel Vance," Ms. Sterling interjected, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "This is a private personnel matter. Ms. Hart violated hospital protocol. She admitted to—" "She lied," Silas cut her off. He reached into the lap of his hospital gown. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the neurotoxin of exhaustion. He pulled out a thick manila folder. It was stamped with red ink. Top secret. SCI, no foreign. He didn't slide it across the table. He threw it. The folder spun across the wet mahogany, scattering papers as it hit Caldwell's chest. "Read it," Silas commanded. Caldwell looked down at the papers. His eyes widened. He flipped a page, then another. His hands began to shake. This is redacted," Caldwell stammered. "Dates, locations. I don't understand." "Page 4, Silas growled. Caldwell turned to page 4. It was a medical after-action report. "Operation Black Wind," Silas recited from memory, his eyes never leaving Evelyn, who stood by the door, stunned. "November 2018. The Vice President's convoy was hit in the Kunar province. The trauma team was wiped out. The VP took shrapnel to the femoral artery and the liver." The room was deathly silent. "There was no surgeon," Silas continued, his voice gaining strength, fueled by the rage burning in his gut. "There was no sterile OR. There was a cave, a flashlight, and Lieutenant Evelyn Hart." He pointed a shaking finger at Evelyn. "That woman," Silas roared, his voice cracking, "performed a liver resection and a vascular graft in a cave, under mortar fire, with dust falling into the open cavity. She kept the Vice President of the United States alive for 6 hours until SEAL Team 6 could punch a hole through the enemy line." Caldwell looked from the file to the middle-aged woman in the navy sweater. He looked at the reading glasses hanging around her neck. He tried to reconcile the grandmother he had just fired with the legend Silas was describing. She's a nurse," Caldwell whispered. "She is a ghost," Senator Thorne corrected him, speaking for the first time since they entered. The ghost surgical team was a classified JSOC asset. They didn't exist on paper because they operated where we weren't supposed to be. Evelyn Hart has more surgical hours in combat than your entire trauma staff combined. Silas leaned forward, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair until his knuckles turned white. The IV line tugged dangerously at his arm. "You fired her for unauthorized surgery?" Silas laughed, a harsh barking sound that turned into a cough. "You arrogant little bean counter. Her medical authority supersedes yours. It supersedes this hospital. In a crisis, under the National Emergency Medical Powers Act, she outranks you." Ms. Sterling closed her laptop. She knew when a case was unwinnable. She knew when a lawsuit wasn't just a threat, but an execution. "Colonel," Ms. Sterling said softly, "what do you want?" "I want her reinstated," Silas said. "Immediately, with back pay and a formal apology." "That can be arranged," Caldwell said quickly, eager to make the scary men go away. "We can rescind the termination letter. It was a misunderstanding." "I'm not finished," Silas said. He looked at Senator Thorne. The senator nodded. "This hospital receives 40% of its funding from the Veterans Choice Program," Silas said. "That is federal money. Senator Thorne is the man who signs those checks." Thorne leaned over the table, his smile sharp and terrifying. "Director Caldwell, if Ms. Hart walks out of this building today, the funding walks with her. I will strip this hospital of its VA accreditation. I will launch a congressional inquiry into your triage protocols that will keep you in court hearings until your grandchildren are born." Caldwell looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at the 5 veterans standing against the wall, men who had bled for the country he was milking for profit. He looked at Silas, the broken warrior who had dragged himself from his deathbed to fight one last battle. And finally, he looked at Evelyn. "Ms. Hart," Caldwell said, his voice trembling, "please, accept our apology We made a mistake." Evelyn walked forward. The room parted for her. She didn't look at Caldwell. She walked straight to the wheelchair. She looked at Silas. He was fading again. The burst of energy was spent, his head was drooping, and the gray pallor was returning to his cheeks. But his hand was still gripping the edge of the table, holding the line for her. "You stubborn son of a bitch," she whispered affectionately. "You ripped your stitches, didn't you?" "Worth it," Silas mumbled, his eyes fluttering shut. "Did we win?" "Yeah, Ghost," Evelyn said, placing a hand on his feverish forehead. "We won." She turned to the 5 veterans. "Ramirez, get him back to the ICU. Gently. If you pop that chest tube, I'll kill you myself." "Yes, ma'am," Ramirez grinned. As the veterans moved to wheel Silas out, Evelyn turned back to the table. She reached out and picked up the top secret file. She closed it with a soft thud. "Director Caldwell," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, the voice of the woman who made soup, but her eyes were the eyes of the woman who had saved a vice president in a cave. "I'll be in at 0700 tomorrow. I expect the new triage protocols to be on my desk. And Director?" Caldwell flinched. "Yes? If you ever speak to my staff like you did today," she nodded toward the empty chair where Dr. Liu had sat. "I won't need the senator. I'll handle it myself." She turned and followed her unit out of the room. The waiting room of the Seattle Veterans Memorial Hospital was no longer a place of chaos. It was busy, certainly. The steady hum of a major medical center never truly ceased, but the frantic, terrified energy that had defined it 2 months ago was gone. It had been replaced by a new rhythm, a rhythm of competence. Dr. Kenji Liu stood at the triage desk. He no longer looked like a terrified intern drowning in a white coat that was too big for him. He stood with his shoulders back, his voice projecting clearly as he directed a team of paramedics wheeling in a cardiac arrest. "Bay 2, Liu ordered, his eyes scanning the monitors. "Start a chemically assisted intubation protocol. I want eyes on the airway in 30 seconds. He glanced up towards the second-floor balcony. Standing there, watching the floor with a clipboard in hand, was Evelyn Hart. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wore a tailored blazer over a professional blouse and a lanyard around her neck that read, "Senior Medical Advisor, Combat Trauma Protocols." Evelyn caught Liu's eye and gave him a subtle nod. "A passing grade." Liu smiled, a quick flash of gratitude, before diving back into the work. Evelyn took a deep breath. The hospital air still smelled of antiseptic, but it no longer smelled of fear. The ghost protocols, as the staff whispered about them, had changed everything. She had turned the emergency department into a well-oiled machine, bridging the gap between civilian medicine and the brutal efficiency of the battlefield. But today, she wasn't staying for the shift change. She checked her watch. On 900. She walked to the elevator, bypassing Director Caldwell's office. The director still worked there, but he was a diminished figure, a man who signed checks and stayed out of the way, terrified of the day Senator Thorne might decide to audit the vending machines. Evelyn stepped out into the Seattle morning. For the first time in weeks, the Pacific Northwest had decided to be merciful. The gray ceiling of clouds had fractured, revealing a sky of piercing, impossible blue. The sun was not just a light source. It was a physical presence, warming the pavement and drying the eternal dampness of the city. She got into her car and drove west toward the water. Elliott Bay sparkled like a field of crushed diamonds. The Olympic Mountains rose in the distance, their jagged, snow-capped peaks looking like white teeth biting into the horizon. Evelyn parked near the ferry terminal at the Olympic Sculpture Park. The air here was different. It smelled of salt water, creosote, and coffee. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely against the hum of the city behind them. She walked to a weathered wooden bench that faced the sound. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, and placed her hands in her lap. Her left hand rested over her right forearm, a habitual gesture, covering the tattoo beneath the fabric of her blazer. She closed her eyes, listening to the water lap against the pilings. "You're early." The voice came from behind her. It was deep, resonant, and familiar, but the jagged edge of pain was gone. Evelyn opened her eyes and turned. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Vance was walking toward her. He was not the broken, dying creature she had dragged into room 4. He was not the pale, wheelchair-bound invalid who had stormed the boardroom. He was a mountain of a man, restored. Silas wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray Henley that stretched tight across his chest, and clean boots. He walked with a cane, a sleek black stick that he used more for rhythm than for support. The paralysis was gone. His stride was long and purposeful, but the biggest change was in his eyes. The storm was over. The 1,000-yard stare that looked through people had been replaced by a quiet, observant calm. And he wasn't alone. Trotting beside him, tethered by a loose tactical leash, was Scout. The golden retriever, the therapy dog who had once barked at the smell of death, now looked like the happiest animal on earth. He wore a new vest that read, "Service dog. Do not pet unless you have treats." "I'm always early, Colonel," Evelyn smiled, shielding her eyes from the sun. "It's the nurse in me. If you're on time, you're late." Silas chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that rumbled in his chest. He reached the bench and unclipped Scout's leash. "Go," Silas commanded gently. Scout didn't need to be told twice. He bounded onto the grass, chasing a seagull with the clumsy enthusiasm of a dog who had forgotten he was working. Silas sat down next to Evelyn. The bench creaked slightly under his weight. For a long moment, they didn't speak. They just sat there, two veterans of different wars, watching the ferry boats cut white wakes across the blue water. "How is the shoulder?" Evelyn asked, breaking the silence. Silas rolled his left shoulder. It moved smoothly, though she saw a slight wince of stiffness. "Better," he said. "The physical therapy is aggressive. My therapist reminds me of you. She doesn't take excuses." "Good," Evelyn said. "You need someone to keep you in line." "I have Scout for that," Silas nodded toward the dog. "He wakes me up at 0500 every morning. If I have a nightmare, he's there before I even open my eyes. He's a better medic than half the corpsmen I've served with." "He chose you," Evelyn said softly. "That night in the ER, he knew." "Yeah," Silas looked down at his hands. "He knew." He reached into the pocket of his jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate. He pulled out a small rectangular box wrapped in black velvet. The atmosphere shifted. The casual warmth of the sunny morning seemed to deepen, gaining a sudden gravity. Silas held the box in both hands, staring at it for a moment before turning to Evelyn. "I went back to the archives," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "After I got out of the ICU, I pulled the full report on Operation Black Wind, the unredacted version." Evelyn stiffened slightly. "Silas, you didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted gently. "I needed to know. I needed to know how Miller died, and I needed to know who was holding his hand." He handed her the box. "Open it." Evelyn took the box. It felt heavy, heavier than it looked. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in the black satin, were two objects. The first was a heavy bronze coin. On one side was the Delta Force insignia, the dagger and the lightning bolts. On the other side, raised in relief, was the unit crest of the 3rd Battalion, but it was the engraving on the rim that caught the light. "For the ghost who watches over us." It was a challenge coin. In the world of special operations, it was more than a souvenir. It was a currency of respect, a bond of brotherhood that said, "You are one of us." But it was the second object that made Evelyn's breath hitch in her throat. Lying beneath the coin was a set of dog tags. They were battered, the metal dull and scratched from the sand of the Syrian desert. The rubber silencers were worn away at the edges. Miller, James, "Oh, positive, Methodist." Evelyn gasped. She reached out and touched the cold metal. A tear, hot and fast, spilled over her lash and tracked down her cheek. "I thought these were lost," she whispered. "I thought they were buried with him." "They were in his personal effects," Silas said. "They were sent to his parents. I visited them last week in Ohio. I told them about you. I told them about the nurse who refused to leave him when the sky was falling." Silas paused, his own eyes glistening. "His mother, she went into his room and brought these out. She said, 'Give them to her. James would want the woman who saved his soul to keep them.'" Evelyn picked up the tags. She clutched them in her fist, pressing the metal hard against her palm until it hurt. The pain was grounding. It was real. "I didn't save him, Silas," she choked out. "I tried. God, I tried." "You didn't save his life, Evelyn," Silas said firmly. He reached out and covered her fist with his large hand. "You saved his dignity. You saved him from dying alone in the dark. That matters more than the breath in our lungs." He looked at her, his expression fierce and tender. "Thank you," Silas whispered. "Thank you for not leaving us. Thank you for not leaving me." Evelyn looked at him. She saw the scars on his face, the gray in his beard, the life in his eyes that she had fought so hard to keep burning. She nodded, unable to speak. She opened her hand and let the dog tags rest there, gleaming in the Seattle sun. Scout, sensing the shift in emotion, trotted back from the grass. He rested his heavy golden head on Silas's knee and looked up at Evelyn, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the bench leg. The ferry boat blew its horn, a deep, mournful sound that echoed off the mountains. But there was no sadness in it today. It was just a sound of departure, of moving forward. Evelyn Hart and Silas Vance sat on the bench, shoulder to shoulder. The nurse and the soldier. The healer and the killer. Two ghosts who had haunted the same desert, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light. Evelyn wiped her tears and smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and stayed there. She closed her fingers around the coin and the tags, holding them close to her heart. "Welcome home, Silas," she said. "It's good to be back," he replied. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the perfect blue sky. Two old soldiers leaning on each other, finally at peace. The journey of Lieutenant Colonel Vance and Nurse Evelyn reminds us of a powerful truth we often forget in our busy lives. Never judge a book by its cover. We live in a world that celebrates the loud, the flashy, and the powerful. We look for heroes in uniforms and high offices, often overlooking the quiet strength standing right in front of us. True resilience isn't always announced with a trumpet. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged woman in scrubs, a tired teacher, or a quiet neighbor. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. They carry scars you cannot see and histories you haven't read. This story teaches us to treat every single person with dignity and respect, because the hand you brush aside today might be the only hand strong enough to save you tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please honor these characters by hitting the like button. It helps us share this message of courage with more people. Share this video with a friend or a veteran who needs to know they are not forgotten. And subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of redemption and faith. Let's close with a prayer. Dear God, we ask for your covering over everyone listening right now. You know the battles they are fighting in the dark, the wounds that no one else sees, and the burdens they carry in silence. We pray that you grant them the strength of a warrior and the gentle heart of a healer. Surround them with your peace that passes all understanding, and remind them that no matter how heavy the storm gets, they are never fighting alone. If you believe in his protecting power, type Amen in the comments below. Stay strong, and God bless you.